Somewhere inside your own skull, a memory exists that you will never be able to reach again. Not because it is gone, because your own brain may have deliberately locked it. Try to remember your first birthday, not a photo of it, the actual moment from the inside. You cannot. Nobody can, and that fact alone should feel far stranger than it usually does. You were conscious. You were forming thoughts, reacting to faces, learning your own name, and yet almost none of it survives as something you can consciously recall today. Scientists call this childhood amnesia, and for decades, the explanation seemed simple enough. Babies, the theory went, simply were not building memories worth keeping in the first place. But that explanation may be wrong, and the real answer is far more unsettling. Somewhere inside your skull, in your earliest years, a war was being fought. Not a war you were aware of. A biological war, fought cell by cell, inside your own brain. And the casualties of that war were the very memories you are trying to remember right now. To understand the battlefield, you need to understand one specific structure, the hippocampus. It sits deep in the brain, shaped roughly like a curved seahorse, which is where its name comes from. Its job is deceptively simple. Take a moment happening right now and file it away for later. A face, a smell, a sound. The hippocampus binds them together into a single retrievable unit. In adults, this system runs relatively smoothly, adding new memories without erasing the old ones. In infants, the system is under construction, in the middle of the fastest growth spurt it will ever have. A newborn's brain is only about 1/4 the size of a fully grown adult brain. By the time that same child turns 2 years old, the brain has already reached 3/4 of adult size. That is an almost violent rate of expansion, compressed into just 24 months. And the hippocampus is right in the middle of that construction site, growing new cells constantly. This process is called neurogenesis, the birth of brand new neurons, one after another, at a staggering pace. It sounds like it should be purely good news. More neurons should mean more memory capacity, intuitively. But neuroscientists studying this process found something almost paradoxical happening instead. New neurons do not politely join an existing memory network without disturbing anything. They compete for space, for connections, for the exact same wiring older neurons were already using. Picture a library where new books are constantly being shelved by physically shoving old books off entirely. That is close to what may be happening inside a developing hippocampus, memory circuit by memory circuit. Researchers studying this in animal models found that boosting neurogenesis actively degraded existing memories. More new neurons literally meant fewer old memories survived intact, tested directly in laboratory conditions. The synapses, the tiny connective bridges between neurons, seemed to get physically replaced in the process. An old memory circuit, quietly overwritten by a newer one competing for the exact same neural real estate. This is the neurogenesis theory of childhood amnesia, and for years, it was the leading explanation available. The idea was almost tragic in its simplicity. Your brain was so busy building itself. It forgot to preserve you. Every new neuron born in your first 2 years may have quietly bulldozed a memory that came before it. Not maliciously, not on purpose. Simply as a side effect of building the most complex object in the known universe. Your own brain, in other words, may have been its own memory's silent enemy, before you even knew you had one. For a long time, this theory fit the data reasonably well and mostly went unchallenged. Then, in 2025, a research team, including scientists at Yale, decided to test something more directly. The exact institutional details of this still emerging research are worth treating with some caution, since findings this recent have not yet had decades to be independently confirmed and retested the way older theories have. Instead of studying rodents, they studied actual human infants using a method called neuroimaging. They showed babies specific images, then later measured brain activity when those same images reappeared. What they found did not fit neatly into the neurogenesis destroys everything story at all. The infant hippocampus was still activating, in patterns that looked remarkably like encoding real memories. In other words, the memories may have been forming successfully after all, contrary to old assumptions. This raised an uncomfortable new question. If the memories were being made, Why can no adult ever reach them? The answer researchers proposed shifted the entire debate from encoding towards something else entirely: retrieval. Maybe the problem was never that the memories disappeared. Maybe the problem is that adult brains no longer know how to ask for them correctly. Think of memory retrieval like a search engine, one that requires the right specific search terms to work. An infant's brain stores an experience using infant-specific context, pure sensation, with no attached language, no names, no timelines, no structured sentences describing what was happening at that exact moment. An adult brain, meanwhile, searches using adult tools: words, chronology, cause and effect, structured narrative. The search terms simply do not match the way the original file was ever labeled inside the brain. It would be like trying to find a file on an old computer using a search engine from 20 years in the future. The file might still be sitting quietly on the hard drive, completely intact, technically speaking. But if the retrieval system speaks an entirely different language than the one used to save it, it stays hidden. This theory reframes childhood amnesia completely, turning destruction into something closer to encryption. Your earliest memories may not be gone. They may simply be locked, waiting for a key nobody has built yet. That idea alone should feel different than it did a few minutes ago, and it should feel a little haunting. Somewhere inside you, right now, there may be a version of your first steps, still technically stored. A version of your mother's voice. The very first time you consciously registered it as familiar and safe. Not destroyed, not deleted. Simply filed under a language your adult mind never learned to speak. Now add one more piece to this puzzle, one that connects directly to how you are understanding this sentence. Language itself may be the missing key researchers are only beginning to understand. Infants do not typically develop functional language until sometime in the second year of life. Before that point, there is no internal narrator translating raw experience into a structured, retellable story. No sentence in your head describing what today felt like, what happened first, what happened next. Psychologists argue that autobiographical memory, the kind you can consciously narrate, depends heavily on language. Without a story structure to attach an experience to, the brain has nowhere stable to file it for later use. This is sometimes called the narrative self, the internal storyteller that begins forming only once language does. Before that storyteller exists, experiences may register briefly and then dissolve without ever becoming a chapter. Not because the moment did not matter, because there was no book yet to write that chapter into. Once language arrives, children slowly begin producing something remarkable: their very first recallable memories. Ask most adults for their earliest memory, and the answer typically lands somewhere between ages 3 and 4. That is almost exactly the window when language, narrative structure, and hippocampal maturity finally start overlapping. It is not a coincidence. It looks, increasingly, like a threshold being crossed all at once. 3 separate systems, developing on 3 separate timelines, finally arriving at a workable intersection. Neural architecture mature enough to hold a memory steady, instead of constantly being rebuilt underneath it. Language mature enough to translate experience into something an adult mind can later search for and retrieve, and a narrative self mature enough to actually want to keep a personal record in the first place. Before that convergence, you existed. You reacted, you learned, you formed attachments that shaped your entire personality. You simply were not yet the kind of creature capable of writing your own biography as it happened. That is a strange kind of existence to imagine. A fully conscious being with a memory system pointed backward, present, aware, forming impressions, and yet incapable of narrating any of it into permanent conscious storage. Now return to the neurogenesis theory for a moment, because it has not been fully discarded either. Modern researchers increasingly suspect both processes are happening simultaneously, tangled together, not competing exclusively. Some memories may genuinely be disrupted by the sheer speed of new neuron production early in development. Others may survive that disruption completely intact, but remain permanently unreachable due to the retrieval mismatch. The truth, as usual in a rapidly developing field, is likely a combination neither theory captures alone. Destruction and encryption, happening at the exact same time, inside the exact same rapidly growing structure. There is another layer to this mystery that rarely gets mentioned, and it comes from culture, not biology alone. Psychologist Chi Wang spent years comparing earliest memories reported by people raised in different cultural traditions. American adults, on average, reported earliest memories from noticeably younger ages than adults raised in China. The biological hardware, the hippocampus, the neurogenesis timeline was presumably nearly identical across both groups. So the difference had to come from somewhere else entirely, something environmental rather than purely neurological. Wang's research pointed toward storytelling itself, specifically how often parents narrate a child's day back to them. Cultures that emphasize detailed personal storytelling, repeated conversations about what happened and when, produced earlier memories. A parent asking again and again what happened at the park today may be doing more than making conversation. That repeated narration may actually help build the exact retrieval scaffolding this entire theory keeps circling back to. In other words, memory may not simply wait patiently for language to arrive on its own timeline. It may be actively built, strengthened, and reinforced by how often a memory gets rehearsed out loud afterward. This adds a strange new twist. Memory retrieval may be partly a skill, not simply a fixed biological deadline. A skill that some environments cultivate earlier and more intensely than others, without anyone realizing it is happening. Now consider a very different, more serious application of all of this: the courtroom. Legal systems around the world have had to wrestle directly with childhood amnesia in the most literal, practical way. Young children are sometimes the only witnesses to events that matter enormously, including abuse or accidents. But if memory formation and retrieval are this fragile before a certain age, testimony becomes scientifically complicated. A 4-year-old might genuinely encode an event accurately, yet struggle to retrieve or narrate it reliably months later. Worse, young children are especially susceptible to having false details accidentally implanted through repeated leading questions. Researchers studying interview techniques found that the way a question is phrased can quietly reshape a child's memory. This is not a child lying. It is a retrieval system, still under construction, filling gaps with whatever fits. Courts have slowly adapted, developing specialized interview protocols designed to avoid contaminating fragile, developing memory systems. None of this would make sense without understanding the underlying neuroscience explored throughout this entire video. Now bring the story back to something smaller, quieter, and far more personal than any courtroom. Think about why parents so obsessively photograph and film their children's earliest years, often without consciously knowing why. Part of it is sentiment, certainly. But part of it may be something closer to outsourced memory entirely. Since the child's own brain may never reliably retrieve this period, someone else has to hold on to it instead. The family album becomes a kind of external hard drive, storing what the child's own mind technically cannot reach. Years later, a photograph does not just show a memory. In a strange sense, it may replace one that never surfaces. When a person says, "I remember my 3rd birthday," they may sometimes actually be remembering a photograph of it. Psychologists call this a source monitoring error, confusing a photograph or a retold story with a genuine internal memory. It is remarkably common, and it blurs the line between what you truly remember and what you were simply told. This does not make those early years less real. It only makes the boundary between memory and myth less obvious than expected. Which raises one final, slightly dizzying question worth sitting with before this story ends. If a photograph can convincingly stand in for a missing memory, how much of any early memory is truly original? Some memory researchers argue that all memory, even adult memory, is partly reconstruction rather than pure playback. Childhood amnesia may simply be the most extreme, most obvious version of something memory does quietly at every age. Every act of remembering may involve some rebuilding, some filling in of gaps using whatever material is available. Your earliest years may just be the clearest demonstration of a truth that applies to your entire life story. Memory was never a perfect recording. It was always closer to a story, rebuilt slightly differently every single time it is told. This matters for a reason that goes far beyond simple curiosity about your own forgotten first years. If some of these locked memories genuinely still exist, questions about their influence become newly urgent. Can an unreachable memory still shape behavior, even without ever becoming consciously available to recall? Some psychologists argue yes, pointing to emotional patterns that seem to form before verbal memory even exists, a fear with no identifiable origin story, a comfort that makes no logical sense given someone's conscious history. These may be echoes of encoded experience, operating below the surface, unreachable by direct conscious retrieval, not ghosts. Not mysticism, simply memory, doing exactly what memory does, minus the part where you can narrate it. This reframes something people often say almost carelessly. I don't remember anything from before I was 4. That sentence may be technically inaccurate, in a very specific and almost unsettling way. The moments were not necessarily absent. The language to summon them back may simply have never been built. Some researchers are now exploring whether specific cues, smells, sounds, physical locations can partially bypass that gap. A particular scent, encountered decades later, sometimes triggers an emotional response with no accompanying verbal memory attached. That gap, between feeling and explanation, may be a direct signature of this exact retrieval problem in action. You feel something. You cannot say why. The why may be locked exactly where this entire story has been pointing. Consider, for a moment, what this means about identity itself, and how much of it forms before conscious record-keeping begins. The earliest architecture of who you are may have been built entirely off the books, unrecorded, unnarrated, unexamined. Your personality did not begin the day your memory did. It began years earlier, in a period you cannot audit. That is either deeply unsettling or strangely comforting, depending entirely on how you choose to think about it. Unsettling, because a version of you exists that you will never consciously meet again, no matter how you try. Comforting, because that version of you still mattered, still shaped things, even without needing to be remembered directly. Every hug, every lullaby, every steady, reassuring voice in your earliest years still landed somewhere inside you. It simply landed in a room your conscious adult mind was never given the key to walk back into. Neuroscience has not yet built that key, and it may take years before anyone manages to build one reliably. But the fact that researchers are now asking the right question changes the entire shape of the mystery. For decades, the question was, why did these memories disappear? The better question, the one now driving actual research, is different. Where exactly are they hiding? And how do we ask correctly? That single shift, from destruction to retrieval, from deletion to encryption, changes everything about how this story should end. Your earliest years were not empty. They were simply recorded in a language your current mind has not yet learned to read. Somewhere in that gap between infancy and language sits an entire chapter of your life, written, sealed, and silently waiting. Not gone, just quiet, patient, and technically still yours, whether or not you ever find the way back in.